welcome to the second episode of the Taco Society Presents. I'm here with my three compatriots.
The Taco Society.
The Taco Society. Gardner Goldsmith, Sydney Leigh, Phillip Perron. All of us are published horror writers. In fact, some of us are publishers, or we work for other publishers. But we're here basically to talk about horror, at least in this episode. When I say horror, that also encompasses some noir, which is a crime thriller genre, and some fantasy. But not always. We will get into other topics, namely writing. If you ever wanted to learn how to write, if you ever had an interest in becoming a writer, a future program will talk about writing, and you can learn the craft and mechanics of writing and see if you have what it takes to be a writer. We will also be talking to The Blank Page. They're a writing group locally out of Goffstown, and they meet on the second Tuesday of every month at 6:30 at the Goffstown Library. With that said, we're going to start our second episode, and we're going to continue where we left off on the first episode. We're going to have Sydney Leigh interview Gardner Goldsmith, and Gardner's going to read from his story. So Sydney, take it over.
Are you ready?
I am ready, Senator. I am ready to testify. My attorney will be speaking for me. Thank you. It is like one of those microphones from a Senate testimony thing. Your Honor, I do not have any recollection of that. Okay, so.
Okay.
Good to have you here.
Good to have you too.
Hit me with your best shot.
All right. So my first question is that you did some script writing for TV before becoming published for your prose,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so I want you to talk a little bit about that and tell us about that and what some of the differences there are in the two kinds of writing, script writing and prose.
Very astute question.
Thank you.
Well, Watson, let me tell you. That's actually, it's quite interesting because as you and I were talking off the air, little script writing lingo stuff, what I think is interesting is I started writing short stories. I used to send short stories to Twilight Zone magazine. I grew up in Amherst, went to Milford Area Senior High School, which is now defunct because it's Milford and Sauhegan separately. But I always loved stories. When I was 7 years old, I told my second grade teacher that I wanted to make monster movies. And I remember I had a record of thrillers and chillers, and it had audio versions of short stories on them. One was The Monkey's Paw by Tony. No, just kidding. Edgar Allan Poe. Tony's getting close, though. He's going to be freaking people out very soon. The Monkey's Paw by W.W. Jacobs and Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe.
Oh,
yeah, sorry. Yeah, no. So on one side it was the Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe, and on the other side it was the Monkey's Paw by W.W. Jacobs. And there were a couple other stories on there too, like The Boy Who Drew Cats by I can't remember, was it Monroe or something? He used to do a lot of stories based in Japan, and they really hit me. I mean, they were just so cool, and I was like, oh man! One of them, the Monkey's Paw, was actually really, really scary.
Yeah, that was scary.
Yeah, and the ending on that is just out of control. So I said, you know what? I love these stories. I want to do monster movies, but I love writing prose. So as I got older, I said, I'm going to concentrate on script writing. So I ended up working in television at Star Trek Voyager and also at The Outer Limits. And what I found was that the process of writing a television script is a lot easier than writing a piece of prose. Because basically all you have to do is you have to know the limitations of your budget. You have to know, can you do scenes? Can you go outside? Are you basically shooting in studio? And from there you can build a story. Once you've done it, it's pretty much dialogue. In fact, most directors and producers want as sparse directions as possible in a script. So whether it's a half-hour comedy or it's an hour-long television show, you have the format. The format dictates to you sort of what you're going to have to do for the buildup of your emotional beats and stuff like that. When you're writing prose, it takes a lot, for me anyway, it takes a lot longer, and I had to learn, and that's why I started to go to horror conventions and writers' conventions, because I would I would go to readings and I would hear people. I'm visual and an auditory learner, and I would hear the way that they would do things, and I say, you know what? Okay, I just learned something. Learning from F. Paul Wilson and Tom Monteleone. You mentioned Doug Winter previously, and all those people. Then I started to attend conventions in England, and I met some of those writers, and they have a slightly different, generally slightly different approach to their writing. Sometimes a little bit more descriptive, maybe a little more adverbs, that sort of stuff. And so I started to learn, and then I said, okay, I'm ready to try to write prose. But it is a lot harder. You've got phrasing, you've got syntax, you've got all the things, you've got internal, what's your point of view going to be? Is it going to be first-person point of view? That allows you to have a little more colorful descriptions than if it were third-person point of view. If it's first-person, you can have the voice of that character in it, and it gets very, very tricky. Is it present tense? Is it past tense? I'll give you an example. If you look at the book, The Hunger Games, that was a brilliant move on her part. She put it in the present tense. And since she put it in the present tense and it's told first person present tense, that means that the main character could die on the next page. If it's in the past tense, you sort of have an idea of, well, you know, this person's telling us something that happened and this person survived. Mm-hmm. So, so all those things I had to learn, and it's been a really rewarding thing. And getting into things like with my first novella, Bite, I was so happy that got published in the UK, because for me, writing prose was very, very, it was a real labor of love. I really, really had to start working at it. So. Yeah.
Good. Okay, thanks.
No problem.
All right, my next question. You grew up in New Hampshire, as you said. H.P. Lovecraft used to incorporate areas of Salem, Peabody, Boston, and Rhode Island into his stories, as most of us know. Maybe some of our readers might as well, or listeners. Are there any aspects of the area, geography, or culture you've used in your writing, and how has that helped or hindered your work?
Well, in fact, I think a lot of us probably incorporate things, the areas we know, things we know. And as you expand, as you travel, some of those unique places that set templates in your mind of what you saw. Like I just have been working on a story in Bath, England, or London. I have a story in Chiral 2 that's based in London. And a lot of this, my novella Bite is based in Las Vegas, because I went to Las Vegas, and I went jogging actually behind some of the casinos and saw what it was like, and I had to walk. It was, it was a weird experience. And growing up around here, there are quarries near my house and places where actually I know that H.P. Lovecraft did come into southern New Hampshire at a certain point. I'm like, man, I wonder if he was affected by any of the weird stuff out here. And it helps my writing, I think, greatly to be able to rely on the images that I can remember. I wrote a story that is in an anthology called The Horror Library 5, and it's based on the farm stand where I worked at McLeod Brothers Farm Stand out on Route 101, right near the Milford-Wilton line. And we used to have these giant coolers, and there's something really nasty inside the giant cooler. And
check that one.
Yeah, so it was fun, and I gave it to some of the people who worked with me. And a girl I was dating at the time, she goes, I remember that. She goes, oh my God, that freaked me out. Oh, that was so nasty. I was like, yeah, that's right. So it's fun, and I think it usually helps you. Sometimes it can hinder you because your stories become too familiar to the readers if it's only in one area, unless they really want to learn about it. I mean, you could have the Spencer novels, and people are really interested in learning more about Boston. But I think sometimes if you have found something that really touched you in a trip or a journey. I went to Australia and I wrote a novella that's based on something I saw in Australia. You can evoke those images in another person's mind. It's just really, that's a great thing to think of, that you've been able to do that,
Yeah, you're very good at that. When I read your work that takes place somewhere else, I am completely transported there.
Oh, cool.
You're very effective with that.
That's great.
Okay, and my last question, is there a difference between the short story format and longer work when it comes to style?
Yeah. Oh, well, Yes, I think there is. I don't know. I'd be interested in asking you the same question, all you guys.
Maybe
the
later.
same question. Yeah, and for you in the audience, those of you who are watching, please remember Tony and Sydney and Phil, the Great Old Ones Publishing, Chiral Mad, the books that we've mentioned in the previous production. And, as I talk about my story, Bite, these are all out there. You can buy these online. You can go to a local bookstore and ask them to order them. They're all available, and they will make your life much better. I know, I know how much they will improve your life, and they will do so.
They'll make you rich
exactly.
Your marriage is failing. It's going to turn right around.
That's exactly it. Everything.
Car's broken. Read one of
They'll
these
make
books.
you
The next
feel
day, it'll be
Exactly.
running like a top.
Exactly. Procuring this book, Bite, will make you. You'll walk with that glow.
This is a genie in a bottle.
That's
It's
right.
a genie in a bottle, yes, with artwork by Ben Baldwin. Look him up online, Ben Baldwin. I'm plugging everybody. So, yeah, I think short, and it's very interesting. You got flash fiction, right? Flash fiction, which has a certain rhythm to it. If people aren't familiar with flash fiction, we were on a panel at the World Horror Thing about that, and that was really great. Flash fiction, either you're doing it live and you've been given a certain number of words and a phrase, and you have to write a story around them, and you have basically 20 minutes to write the story, and then you have to read it afterwards. Or it's an online assignment, and they tell you, okay, it's got to be under 600 words, it's got to be under 500 words, and we need it by such and such a day. So you have a little more time to work on it. But the flash fiction stuff that's live is crazy, and 20 minutes, like, it's nuts, and you have to make that face too. So flash fiction has its own sort of rhythm to it, that if you can find your rhythm, you can usually write a pretty cool flash fiction. Short stories, I think, allow you to be more poetic. You can have your prose have a certain sense to it that when you're writing a novel, you can't do that. Because with a novel, if you keep doing that over and over again, it almost becomes tiresome or tiring. There are certain writers who can do it, but to maintain a narrative that is not just a compelling story, but is almost poetic in its writing. I'll give you an example. There's a writer named E.R. Edison who wrote a book called The Worm Ouroboros, and he was around 1920s, 1930s in England, and it's an epic fantasy story. And he was an expert in Norse mythology and stuff, and the writing in it is so dense, it's almost Shakespearean. So literally, it's amazing writing. It's gorgeous writing, but I can only read about 5 pages at a whack, and I'm not reading it for the story. I'm reading it for the writing. So that's generally, I think, with a novella like Bite. With a novella, you can do a little more with a novella. I think you can combine the both. And personally, I think the novella is just about the right length, the perfect length. About 20,000 words for a horror story.
I agree.
It's perfect. So, yeah, there you go.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Are you ready to read something from Bite?
I am ready to read.
Well, we're here to listen.
This is actually a piece that is in the back of Bite, which we have 2 short stories in the back of Bite, and this was published in Chiral Mad 1.
Whitechapel was 2, so.
Yeah. Oh no, that's right. Oh yeah. No, this was alone was published in the New England Horror Writers anthology, Epitaphs, the first year. So this was published in a New England Horror Writers thing, and then I have another story that was also published in Chiral Mad 1. And Chiral is Chiral. If you're just tuning in and you haven't seen the cover of the book, it's a really great series of anthologies. And Chiral Mad 3 will be coming out soon, and she's got poetry in it.
And he does too.
Yay! So, and we didn't even plan that. Okay, so this is called Alone, and I mentioned W.W. Jacobs. If you have read The Monkey's Paw, think about The Monkey's Paw. Not for the story here, but you'll see. Okay. This is just a short that's in the back of this, just to add a little content for people. He was alone. The soft, ratty recliner embraced him like a diseased paramour, its tattered and decomposing arms wrapping around him as if in a love embrace. The beer moved automatically to his lips, flat and bitter. the last of the lot, the last beer he'd been able to find. It had been sitting in his clutch for an hour, warm as soup, foul as brine, but he held it nonetheless, as if tenaciously gripping a vestige of himself. His fingers and palms ached, not from the intensity of his rictus hold on the drink, but from the hammering, the staccato blows against the spikes, driving them deep into the 2x4s, slamming the beams against the frames of the doors and windows. The drywall wouldn't do. He needed wood. They would be coming for him eventually, and he knew that plasterboard wouldn't hold. His wife and daughter were decaying in the other room, what was left of their human bodies swelling and turning to rot. Soon the flesh would be falling off their bones, their skeletal frames exposed, the essence of their lives lost for all time. But it was better than the alternative. He wanted to take them out before they began to stink, before the acrid perfume of their bodies seeped throughout the house to permeate everything, and before that foul, noxious stench could drown his memories of what had been. It would get into the carpets, into the chairs. It would invade the curtains that were going yellow and dusty behind the lattices of pine he had nailed to the frames. But he couldn't take them outside. He had to live with the smell and the reality that he was the last man alive. It was strange how one's mind dealt with horror, true horror. The fear he had felt had moved in on him with stealth. First, it had manifested itself as a nagging, irritating sense of disquiet, an indefinable something that bugged him a tiny bit each day. Things outside were different. The people were different. It wasn't a pleasant place to be anymore. It had changed. They had changed. And as the burden of days accumulated, the realization became more defined. Something was happening. They were becoming something else. Sitting here now, at the end of everything, it seemed almost humorous how innocent he had been, how he had missed everything for so long, overlooked the changes until it was too late. Upon finally opening his eyes to reality, he saw that it was all around him. Within weeks, the world was inside out. It was over. He never imagined people could turn into such unspeakable creatures. There had been so many, friends and co-workers, neighbors and passers-by. He'd seen it happen to each of them. He could think about it all again, but now their names seemed irrelevant, their faces a blur, and the inhuman sounds of their voices merely part of a horrific fugue. Perhaps that was how the mind defended itself during fights for one's life, by pulling away from the details, creating protective abstractions, overlooking the closest, deepest terrors in favor of a larger picture, a picture of survival. Even the images of his wife and child had become part of it. Was this how it was to end? Humanity's last haggard breaths taken in a state of near oblivion? Perhaps. But even now, he held on, out of sheer strength of will and adherence to principle. He was the last human, the only one who could remember how it had been. As the world closed in, he would fight it. He had seen what had happened to them and was not going to let it happen to him. He would resist. He would be himself to the last, and in the end, he would die a man. He heard the thick buzzing of a large, heavy fly. They were coming. He knew, and he was waiting, waiting. Outside, the traffic flowed freely along a hot and shimmering road.
Excellent.
So there you go. So
Very good.
thanks, thank you. Thanks. And that last line is based on the rhythm of the last line of W.W. Jacobs' Monkey's Paw, because at the end of that says outside the street lamp opposite shone on a cold deserted lane.
Nice.
So I wanted that rhythm in the end of it. So there you go. So thank you for letting me read that.
Thanks, Sydney. Thanks, Gard.
Wonderful.
Thanks,
Yeah.
Phil. That's it? We're all set?
Got to do you.
Oh, jeez.
I got some questions for
Nice
you.
try,
Oh,
Tony.
I almost got out of it, didn't I?
I got some questions for Tony. I feel like it's a musical. I've got some questions for Tony. Tony's really good. Or you could be like, Tony's great. Okay. How many times did you get that as a child?
How many what? I'm sorry?
When you were named Tony, did they ask you, are you great? And you're like, all right, shut up.
Oh, Tony the Tiger.
Yeah, you want some Frosted Flakes, Tony?
Why don't we just move along?
All right, Tony. First of all, tell everybody out there where they can look for your work, how they can spell your last name, that sort of thing.
Basically,
it's a little tricky with you.
Yeah, it is. My real name obviously is Tony Tremblay. As Phil keeps asking me, I'm from New Hampshire. I'm from the Goffstown, Manchester area. I do write under a different name. My pen name is T.T. Zuma. The T.T. is Tony Tremblay. The Zuma is from a beach out in California. It's also the title of a Neil Young album. The reason I go under T.T. Zuma is because I have a day job. And I meet with a lot of clients, a lot of customers, a lot of vendors. And a lot of them might not be that overly excited that I write horror. And if they happen to read some of my stories, I don't know if they'd want to be customers much longer.
Sales would drop.
Exactly.
Huh? Sales of your stories might go up, but
So that's why I use a pen name, and that's how they can find me. If they go online, they can look at. I don't have an author page yet, but I am listed in several pages. We're going to talk about Anthicon at the end a little bit, but all the anthology books that are released from Anthicon, I'm in the anthology year 1, year 2, year 3. I'm also in the New England Horror Writers anthologies, Epitaphs, as you mentioned earlier, and I'm also in the new one that'll be released in another 2 weeks, Wicked Tales. I've been in the Piercing the Darkness, which was a charity anthology, which was released about 6-7 months ago, which did very, very well. Some very big names in that. I was in Beware the Dark magazine over in England. Also, I did reviews for Horror World and Nancy Calanta for about 5 years now, and it's been a wonderful experience, and I've learned a lot, and I can't thank Nancy enough. If it wasn't for her, I wouldn't be here today, and I wouldn't be writing.
That's pretty cool, and I've heard good things about Nancy too.
Nice lady.
That's excellent. And all right, I've got some questions for you. Are you ready, Tony?
I didn't do it.
Mr. T.T. Zuma.
Go ahead.
Okay. All right. How long have you been writing, and what types of stories have you been writing?
I've been writing for about 5 years. Most of the stories I write are horror, but some are noir or crime related. In fact, the one I'm going to read tonight is a noir type story, not horror. I've done a little bit of both, and I like them both. And I think you'll find that a lot of horror writers do enjoy getting into crime or noir. It's a different genre, noir than crime, but I'll just put them together for the purpose of our discussion. But yeah, no, I really enjoy it. There's some great horror writers out there that write noir. Bracken McLeod, we talked about him earlier. Chris Irvin. It's just it's a lot of fun.
Yeah.
More than anything else. And
I love that, as you say, a lot of horror writers like to get into crimes. Well, I haven't been convicted of anything, but yeah, you know. So.
Did I say that?
Yeah. Petty thievery occasionally.
No felonies.
No felonies. No copyright infringement. That's for sure. So as you've gone about this. First, I should ask you, and you can combine the answers here. I'd like to find out about the process of your writing. You know, do you have a certain set routine in order to get it all done? And how long ago did you start writing, and how did you come upon this routine to be able to get it done?
It's funny. A lot like Phil's answer. I do it here and there. I try to find the time. Sometimes I do it during lunch. Sometimes early in the morning. Usually in the evenings. Every weekend I write. Whether it's for a little while or a long time. But it's catch where catch can. Mm-hmm. You try to find the time and you do it. But one thing I will say about writing is, if I sit down and start writing, if I'm really into it, I'll think 10 minutes has gone by, and I'll look up at the clock, and 2 to 3 hours have gone by. It's so much, I don't want to say fun, because it's really not fun. It's a lot of work. But you just get so into your work that you lose all track of time. And there's nothing better than that kind of feeling.
Yeah,
when you look up and you see what
getting
you've
a
done.
lot of nods.
Yeah.
Everybody agrees.
Yeah.
Yeah. The Taco Society agrees.
Well, that's the beauty of writing. You know, if you really enjoy what you're doing, even though it's work, if you really enjoy it, those are the rewards.
Yeah.
They really are.
And how long ago did you try to start writing? And did you get on that pattern? On
You know, it's the first thing I ever wrote, I was in high school, and I wrote a story, sent it into my creative writing teacher. And she actually read it out in class. She thought it was good, and I got an A. And the funniest thing is, years later, my brother had the same teacher in creative writing, and he asked me, he says, "Tony, I need a story." 'Cause she's asking me for a story. Basically, I rewrote the same story and gave it to him.
did he get an A?
You got to see.
He's like,
So-
you sabotaged
Oh,
me,
I know,
dude. I'm trying to help you out.
That's the way it goes. But yeah, I've been writing since high school.
That's funny.
Yeah, and the first story I ever got published was 5 years ago. And again, Nancy Calanta in Horror World, she published it. I sent it originally to an Australian publisher who came back and said, "Oh, I love this. It's just I can't put it in right now." And so I asked Nancy to take a look at it, and she said, "I'll do it."
Oh, that's awesome.
So it was my first sale. It was pretty much a pro sale, so I was very happy.
Good. That's fantastic, man. You're starting off with a good shot in the arm for confidence on getting a pro sale.
It
That's
did.
really cool.
It did. Yeah.
And if people aren't familiar, you know, now there's so much out there. But when you're a number of years ago, there weren't as many markets out there, and you either gave something up for free or you took a shot and tried to get a pro sale, and that was like cross your fingers time. It's still sort of like that in a way.
Yeah,
So,
I mean, if you're gonna write for the money. You know,
Yeah.
It sounds horrible, but
write the quality that you think can get money.
exactly.
Don't ever undersell your
Well-
abilities and send something out when it's not good enough.
Yeah, even if it's for free.
Exactly.
Don't do it.
Exactly. Don't do it.
Have enough
'cause it'll be
confidence in
out there.
yourself.
Right.
No offense to a publisher, but if a publisher's not paying, and we're a publisher also, if a publisher's not paying, he's getting all the rewards. He's making all the money. And Tom Piccarelli says it best: the money flows down to the writer, and it does, and it should.
It should. It should.
Small press publishers don't make any money.
Don't do
That's
it.
true. That's
So-
true.
So I've got the last
vouch for
question
that.
is,
We
okay.
pay money to publish.
Yeah, oh my God, yeah.
Yeah, true.
Oh yeah.
Me and Sid could give many stories.
The amount of
It's
work
not
you
just
put
you
into
two.
it.
I mean, I've been
Yeah.
there too. And
Well, it's-
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's amazing to
Yeah,
think
that's
about
right, you mentioned.
on the publishing side the amount of work people put into it that's never seen. So here's a question: if you had the chance to invite 4 authors to dine with you, alive or dead, you pick. Who would they be?
Well, here's 3. So
Yeah.
well, you know, I'm gonna
We'll have
qualify,
dinner. We're having dinner later.
I'm gonna qualify this by saying I'm gonna pick 4 authors who I've never met.
Okay.
Okay, because I've been so fortunate over the last 5-6 years where I've met almost all my heroes, and I've either had lunch or dinner or shared drinks with them. So I'm gonna come up with 4 authors who I would love to meet, and people probably figured out. We've talked about this question before the show, so I do have an answer.
All right.
The first person I want to mention is Sandy DeLuca. She's a horror/noir writer out of Rhode Island, and I just absolutely love her work. It's very, very dark, and she writes from a very feminine point of view, and you don't see a lot of that in horror. And I'll probably get letters from in some irate comments, but there's just something about Sandy's writing where you can put yourself into her eyes, and you feel it. I mean, as a male, when you read her work, you know, it just touches you. You realize what she's going through, and her characterization is fantastic. Atmosphere is fantastic. So Sandy would be one I would have. Rob Dunbar, we've talked about Rob Dunbar earlier. Another great guy. He did a series on the Pine Barrens. In fact, I think they're called the Pines.
The Pines.
The shore. And he did a book of short stories called Martyrs and Monsters. The guy is brilliant, but he's also funny as hell. And I just think if he was at a party, you would just not stop laughing. He's one of those guys that has done everything, knows a little about a lot, and he'd just be fun to talk to.
That's cool.
And I all my experience with him is through Facebook and Horror World, and he actually wrote the introduction to Eulogies 3.
So, Robert, when you watch this, it's time for the Taco Society. We need some tacos for this man. Get it?
2 left. Steve Vernon, he's a writer out of Canada. Steve is fantastic. He writes, his characters are usually from humble beginnings, or if they're not, they're people who are humble themselves. He is gross. He's brutal, but his sense of humor is so black and so hilarious. He's another one. I think if you got him and Dunbar together, I mean, it would just, the chairs would break from people just slamming down their hands so much because he's so funny. So I'd love to have Steve. And the last one is someone who I've never met, and I don't know a lot about, but her name is Mercedes Yardley. In all my experience about Mercedes is either Facebook where I see her posts, but mostly it's from a book called Beautiful Sorrows. It's a short story book that is just so powerful, so melancholy, if you want to use, someone used that term earlier, I think it was Phil. You read these stories and you start, your eyes open, your mouth opens, and then your heart follows. They are just so good. And she has a theme, not the whole book, but through a lot of these stories about angels. About stars. I don't know where angels came from stars. And I called them her star stories, and I saw her on Facebook, she says the same thing, my star stories. They are absolutely worth reading. So if you're looking for a nice, powerful, affecting short story collection that's not hardcore, I mean, it just really speaks to you, I would get Beautiful Sorrows by Mercedes Yardley.
And that was published by Shock Totem, right?
It was, yeah, Shock Totem, yeah.
I wrote the introduction to that.
Did you really?
Yeah.
I didn't realize it. I don't remember that.
I have the catalog, but haven't read that one yet.
Boy, I tell you, Mercedes there are 2 people on the planet right now that I consider to be the contemporary heirs to Roald Dahl.
Oh, okay.
One is Mercedes Yardley, and the other is Rob Shearman over in the UK.
See, I compared her to Neil Gaiman. I thought
she's very much like Neil Gaiman. Yeah, and it's just amazing. And when we did the panel on flash fiction, I learned how to write. Like, I've done okay in flash fiction competitions because I saw her. And I watched what she did, and I was like, I made it sort of a little science, like, what the heck is she doing there? Yeah,
she's a firecracker.
Beautiful Sorrows is great.
I mean, you read her posts, she's got a sense of humor that is just, outrageous. She's just a lot of fun. And I figured if I had Sandy, Rob, Steve, and Mercedes at my dinner table, and somebody threw 5 pizzas down and 5 bottles of wine, I mean, it would be a night to remember. I would learn so much from those people.
Yeah. What was that meeting that Shelley, when Mary Shelley came up with the challenge for Frankenstein, they had all the writers were together and they had their little group. That would be what it would be like. Yeah. That's what it like. And I hope people who are watching, if they take an opportunity to write down Mercedes' name, everybody's names, and check these out online.
Well, I hope they write down our name.
Yeah, definitely. So you have something to read to us?
Yeah, I do. I'm going to read a story from Anthology Year 1. As I mentioned, it's not horror. It's a crime, a noir story. And it's set in Goffstown. A lot of my stories are set in Goffstown. We were talking about local settings earlier. And it's called The Old Man. I called him the old man, though he wasn't really that much older than me. Maybe it's my ego talking here, but from a respectable distance, we didn't look like 2 guys who had just reached retirement age. Hell, if you cocked your head to one side and squinted, you might even say we looked alike, though his ears stuck out farther than mine and his hair was a bit grayer. And yeah, maybe our marathon running days were behind us, but we were still both in pretty good shape physically, and I bet he could have handled himself quite nicely in a tough situation, if it came down to that. We'd met in Goffstown on the first day of fishing season in New Hampshire, when he saw me casting a line from the concrete bridge spanning the Pascataquag River. He wandered across the bridge and over my way with a bamboo pole draped over his shoulder, a tackle box dangling from one hand, and a smile that could put a crying baby at ease. We made small talk about trout, bass, and catfish. After a while, the discussion turned to ourselves. We were both recently retired and had some time on our hands. And in a town as small as Goffstown, in the warmer months anyways, that time was spent with a hand wrapped around a fishing pole. We continued to run into each other often after that first meeting. Before you know it, it became a routine where we'd meet up every morning at the bridge, drop our lines into the water, and spend the morning feeding the fish and passing the time together. When we get tired of rehooking bait, or if the fish stopped biting, we would head over to the Lions Club popcorn stand in the center of town, grab a bag of that greasy stuff along with a drink to wash it down. Then we'd mosey on back to the bridge and sit on the bridge benches that overlooked the water. We'd shoot the breeze about the news, the local gossip, and of course, the weather. He'd talk about anything. Well, anything except his past. Even though we spent most of our summer days on that bridge throwing fish back into the river and kibitzing, I never really got to know his background all that well. I did learn that he was once married, had no kids, and had lived in Goffstown for only a short time. Currently, he lived by himself in a small apartment off Church Street, only a few blocks away from the bridge. He kidded me about my 10-minute drive every morning and often reminded me about the empty apartment next to his. Without fail, he would nod his head in agreement and smile when I replied I had a rental house that was tucked into the woods and I liked my privacy. No way was I going to trade that away for a shorter commute to a fishing spot. Of course, he meant well. He was just a lonely old guy looking for someone to chum around with. I really didn't need to know all that much about his background. He became my fishing pal and I enjoyed his company. And besides, he didn't need to know that much about mine either. So one morning, we're both sitting there on one of the benches overlooking the river, stuffing our faces with popcorn and discussing the finer points of Raquel Welch, when I heard a muffled sound from behind us. Though it initially triggered some warning bells, I ignored it, thinking it had come from one of the cars passing by on the bridge. I looked down at the bag tucked between my legs, intending to grab another handful of popcorn, when I pulled up short. I noticed something odd. He was streaked with splashes of red. Confused, I turned to face the old man. I saw his arm. It was hanging in midair between his knees and his mouth, frozen, with a fistful of popcorn clutched tightly in his hand. It, too, was soaked in red, as was the rest of his hand. Alarmed, I looked closer and saw that his eyes were wide open and staring straight ahead. At his throat was a hole as big as a quarter, blood spurting out of it like a ruptured hose. Then slowly the old man turned to look at me. The corners of his mouth were sunk and his brow was wrinkled. He tried to speak, but all that came out was a gagging noise. Then his eyes closed and he tilted, sliding towards me. As he leaned against my shoulder, his blood dripped onto my thigh, and it soaked into the bag of popcorn. I pushed the old man upright and turned around to look behind us. A young guy in an overcoat stood there, a look of satisfaction on his face as he stared at the back of the old man's head. He was holding a handgun equipped with a suppressor. I recognized it as a Glock 17. The tip of the suppressor was still smoking. The young guy turned and faced me. When our eyes met, he gasped and took a step backwards. Then he swung the handgun towards me and pulled the trigger. Nothing happened. So he tried it again. Still, the handgun didn't fire. He stood for a moment, stunned. With panic in his eyes, he quickly pocketed the Glock and ran toward the road, crossing over the bridge. Twice he looked back at me. Each time, I swear, I saw anguish on his face. Though it pained me to do so, I left the old man there on the bridge. Before leaving, I had gone into his pockets and removed his wallet and identification, throwing them into my tackle box. Then I gathered up my gear and headed straight to the car. I had to get home and get there fast. I knew the old man's murder might be the biggest crime this town had ever seen, so I wasn't surprised as I drove by the police station on the way to my rental house, and I noticed a flurry of activity. Cruisers were pulling in and out of the parking lot with their blue lights flashing and sirens calling. With the amount of foot traffic around the bridge, I figured it wouldn't be all that long before the old man was found. I had hoped for at least 10 minutes for a delay before the cops responded, then a few hours more after that before they discovered who he was and who his fishing buddy might have been. The clock had started ticking, and I needed to get back home. There was precious little in the house that I needed, but I did have a stash there with traveling money and a gun, and I was in desperate need of both. When I pulled into the driveway, I saw right away that someone had been in the house. Whenever I leave, I put a small garden gnome at the outer edge of the back door. I do the same thing with a small flower vase by the front door. Anyone entering would displace these items by a few inches when opening the doors. I saw the garden gnome had been pushed to the side. Despite any indication that the intruder was still in the house, and if so, that it was the guy who murdered the old man, my gut told me that was the case. I turned off the car and headed up the back stairs. After crossing a small deck to reach the door, I stood off to one side and made a show of pulling out my keys. I jiggled them a bit, reached out, and then I put the key into the lock. Sure enough, splinters of wood exploded from the door, and 2 holes appeared in its center, right where I should have been standing. I dropped down to the deck, grunting, making as much noise as possible. Then I got back up and stood to the side of the door again, this time flattening myself against the wall. I got lucky. I didn't have to wait long for him to make his move. The door opened slowly. I saw the tip of the suppressor inch its way through the opening, and, as I expected, it was angled down. Seconds later, the Glock came into view. Then, the hand that held it. I noticed it was shaking. I quickly grabbed the guy's exposed wrist and slammed it against the door frame. I expected to hear another muffled shot, but the force of the blow must have caused him to release the gun, and it clattered to the deck. I jumped out from the wall, and now face to face with the intruder, I gave him a quick knee to the groin. He doubled over, and I followed it up with a right to the jaw. Moaning, he dropped like a lead sinker. This was too easy. I kicked the gun from the deck into the house and grabbed the guy by the collar and dragged him into the living room. After depositing him on the floor, I went to the bookshelf, opened up a hollowed-out, leather-bound copy of the King James Bible, and removed the cash and a snub-nosed pistol. Pointing the gun at the intruder, I told him to get his ass off the floor and to sit in the easy chair. Groaning, he rose haltingly and plopped down into the cushions. While he sat, I took a few seconds to look him over. As I suspected, he was just a kid, mid-20s at best. "So, Sammy's sending babies now to do his dirty work," I said to him. And sounding somewhat offended, I added, "Freaking amateurs." "I'm no amateur," he replied, reacting to the disgust in my voice. "The hell you ain't. Those misfires back at the bridge? I'm betting it's because you used match-grade ammo. It's prone to misfiring with a dirty chamber." I looked back at the 2 holes in the door. "But you must have figured that out." Then I added with a chuckle, "Bit too late, though." The kid sighed and hung his head. "And you screwed up royally by mistaking my fishing buddy for me." With his head still down, he whispered, "Yeah, I thought it would be easier doing you at the bridge than here." "So, after you messed up the hit, you came here anyways and waited for me. I saw the look on your face when you ran. You knew that Sam was going to have your head if he found out you killed the wrong guy." I barely heard the word "yeah" when he spoke it again. Now it was my turn to sigh. Slowly, the kid lifted his head and looked me in the eyes. "What did you do to Sammy to piss him off so much?" His hands were shaking again. I debated whether to tell him or not. The kid got himself involved with a lot more than he could handle, and now he was going to pay the price. The least I could do was answer his question.
Oh, man. That was great. T.T. Zuma, the old man.
And
Anthology year 1.
And I like the rest of the story.
Oh, you read the whole thing?
Mm-hmm.
Oh,
That is cool. And Anthology Year 1 is available online. People can pick that up if they want to look for it, Anthology Year 1, and will be available at Anthocon, correct?
It will be. Yeah, let's talk just
Yes.
a few seconds or a few minutes about Anthocon.
Yeah.
That is a horror convention coming up June 5th through June 7th in Portsmouth, New Hampshire.
Tony, if I could interject.
Absolutely.
I would call it genre convention.
Rather than
Good
just
point.
horror,
yeah.
you mean.
Fantasy,
Speculative
noir,
fiction,
yeah.
Yeah.
Speculative
Well, they also have
fiction.
more than just literature, too. From what I understand, there's movie-related
Art exhibits.
art exhibits. I think last year they even had, what's
Music.
that green drink? Abstinence?
Oh, absinthe,
Yeah,
yes.
they had-
yes.
This year they're having a role-playing demonstration.
Oh, there you
for
go. Okay.
role-playing games or something.
If you, dark fiction may be a better word
I
to
think
use.
it's speculative fiction.
Speculative
fiction.
fiction,
Yeah.
there you go, speculative fiction. It's a convention, By this time, it may be too late to register, but you never know. You should come on down to Portsmouth. It's at the Holiday Inn.
They actually do have day passes, I'm told.
They do have day
Yeah,
passes.
yeah.
So
Fantastic.
walk-ins, for walk-ins.
Yeah, so I'm
Saturday.
going to have to do those. Yeah.
Saturday
Okay.
day passes.
Yeah.
It is. There's two conventions in New England. One is Anthocon. The other is Nikon. That somewhat horror related, or primarily horror related. And Anthocon is a lot of fun. It's very professional. When I say professional, a lot of great authors show up. This year, one of the keynote authors is Gene O'Neill.
Oh, I cannot wait. Coming from the West Coast.
He's
man.
flying all the way down here.
Awesome.
I'm really looking forward to meeting Gene.
And his novella At the Lazy K will be debuting from Written Backwards, Michael Bailey's company that
There you
has
go.
released Chiral Mad 1, 2, and 3, and
Library of the Dead.
Qualina and Library of the Dead. So many good things.
Oh.
Gene is a great, great guy.
Gord Rollo's going to be there.
Gord Rollo from Canada, terrific writer. Yeah.
Christopher Gold's going to be there.
Christopher is awesome.
The newest member newest citizen of New England,
Jim
James
Mo-
A. Moore.
James
Yeah,
Moore.
the great
And-
James A. Moore.
And isn't it great, too? James Moore, if people aren't familiar with James Moore, he has had a couple novels just recently released, epic fantasies,
A fantastic.
that have gotten such great reviews. James A. Moore, everybody, if you can keep it in mind, the audience out there, however big or small, on the television or on YouTube, just a great guy here in New England.
It's funny. I usually do a year in review of all the reviews that I've done for Horror World, and I had the hardest time picking my favorite book from last year, and it came down between Christopher Golden's Snowblind and James A. Moore's Seven Forges series, the last book in that series, and I went with Jim's book.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
I loved Snowblind.
Snowblind is
Oh,
great.
if you like Stephen King, if you like these big outdoor, wide horror adventures like they used to do,
Yeah.
Snowblind is I can't recommend it enough. I
It's
really
terrific.
can't. Yeah.
Yeah, and Christopher Golden is one of the real good guys in the
Oh, he
community. There's
is.
so many
He is.
good people, but Chris is just a terrific guy. He'll often come up to Toadstool Bookshop or go be at a Barnes & Noble in the area. He lives down in the Massachusetts area. Jim has moved to the Massachusetts area. And so many awesome people. Bracken, you mentioned Bracken McLeod. So I hope people will write down all their names
I would
and
like
check
to
them out.
mention a couple too.
Go ahead.
M.J. Preston, also known as Mark Preston, he's
Yeah.
coming from Canada as well.
Wrote The Equinox, a great book.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
reviewed that as a matter of fact, and I think you know him. You just mentioned him earlier, Gregory L. Norris.
Oh, great,
Yes.
great
Editor,
writer.
writer,
Prolific.
worked on Star
Star
Trek
Trek.
Voyager just as you
Prolific.
did.
I've heard so much about him. I have to meet him. I
Oh, you
can't
haven't
wait.
met Greg?
Oh.
I
Oh,
haven't
you'll
met
love
Greg.
Yeah,
And
you'll love Greg.
yeah.
Yeah,
So.
so I just wanted
So
to mention those folks.
talented.
Yeah.
Greg, if you're watching later on, I'm looking forward to meeting you.
Yay!
That'd be great.
Yeah, and he actually has been on
Chronicle.
Chronicle, the New
Yeah.
Hampshire
Oh,
Chronicle,
cool.
as a matter of fact. Yeah.
Awesome.
And
So-
his movie that he wrote, the movie
That's
that
right.
he
Yeah,
just
yeah, he
recently
wrote the screenplay for
screenplay
yeah, that's coming out
for
this week.
It's coming
Available.
to all the
With
stores and so
stores,
forth in the
yes.
next 2 weeks, I believe.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Very
Can't wait to
prolific
see
writer.
that.
Yeah, good, very good writer.
Mhm.
Yeah, and that's Anthocon. So if you get a chance, come on down. Not this weekend. Well, depending when you see this, the
Right.
weekend of June 5th through the 7th, and then later on in July, there's another con, as I mentioned earlier, called Nikon, and we'll talk a little bit more about Nikon and some of the future shows we do. But that's another one that's you just can't miss. Great horror writers attend Nikon. F. Paul Wilson.
Oh yeah.
The same Christopher Golden.
Chris Golden.
There's
So many.
Tom Monioli.
Yeah,
There's
Jack
so
Ketchum,
many.
I believe, isn't
Yeah,
he?
Jack Ketchum.
Jack Ketchum.
Yeah.
And by the way, Anthocon, Tom Monteleone will be at
that's right.
Anthocon
Is
along
it F.
with
Paul Wilson?
F.
Yeah.
Paul's
Yeah.
coming
Yeah.
up as well, and so that's going to be great.
There's
And
two great cons, one after another.
Oh,
It's
yeah.
Well, 3. We just had
World Horror was pretty amazing.
that's in the
Atlanta.
past, though. We don't. Talk
Yeah,
it's not
true.
New England.
Yeah, and it's not New England.
And
Sorry.
Anthocon happens down in Bristol,
Bristol,
at
yes.
Roger Williams University.
No, actually,
Portsmouth.
Nikon.
Oh, did I say
Yeah.
Nikon? Yeah, Nikon's down at Bristol, and it's awesome.
It's actually in Portsmouth too, but they changed it to Bristol, so it
What's
I
that?
think it's in Portsmouth. I think the actual town that
Oh,
Leigh
really?
held in
Oh,
is in
really?
Portsmouth.
Portsmouth,
Oh,
Rhode Island.
wow.
Yeah.
Oh, that's
So
interesting.
that's why they say Bristol.
Oh, that's so. Yeah, because they used to have it directly at Roger Williams
Exactly,
University on the
yeah.
campus. Now it's sort of off campus,
campus.
near a little farm stand. The farm stand stuff keeps coming back.
Yeah.
But yeah, and it's a great community, and people are interested in writing. You know, if you can go to any of these conventions and you meet some of the writers, you go to their readings, you hear them read.
And
It's
the
a really great
workshops,
experience.
the
Yeah.
panels.
Oh yeah,
it's really
If
enjoyable.
you're thinking of being a writer, if you do some writing, or if you just want to meet some really nice people,
Yeah.
come down to either convention, and hopefully we'll see you there.
Yeah.
Just wanted to say thanks to these three great authors for bailing me out and helping me out here on the show, and you will see them in the future on other shows.
Hopefully not Cops or America's Most Wanted.
No, I'm other shows for the Taco
That's a good
Society
point.
presents.
Yeah.
Again, our mission here is to promote horror, to promote horror writers, even though we may diverge from that for a show or two. New England Horror Writers, that's us.
Yeah, man. The Taco Society.
The Taco
we will
Society.
never reveal how the name the Taco Society, that whole experience that we had down in South America. Not going to
Okay.
talk
Well,
about
yeah.
that.
Tacos and something like that.
And we will be
Yeah, I know.
actually
It's more Central America,
interviewing-
but still.
The churros.
We will be
Society.
taping, I
Churros
should say,
Society.
the New England Horror Writers Association reading of Wicked Tales at Anthicon. So another good reason to come down there and see it. And if you can't see it, you'll see it right here on this station soon.
Right on.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.